All right, so thank you everybody for attending this American Library in Paris virtual evenings with an author. We're very, very glad to have you with us tonight. I'm Catherine O'Lean, Programs Manager at the American Library. I wanted to begin by saying a couple of words about us if you're not familiar, perhaps not local, you haven't had the chance to visit us in person. We are the largest English language lending library on the continent. We are also open right now, despite, sort of the curfew that France has introduced in many cities. We remain open. We're practicing, we wear our masks, we're very safe, we socially distance. So the library is limited to basically come in and browse and check out your books and enjoy them at home. So you can definitely visit us if you're local. You can look into membership if you haven't yet become a member. That's all available online. I should also say we're also an independent nonprofit. We don't receive support from either the French or the US government. We instead rely on the generosity of our community and on our donors. So thank you to those of you in the audience who support the library. We're also 100 years old. So 2020 has been our centennial year. It's been a very interesting year to celebrate such an exciting thing for the institution. We had our gala, Centennial Gala, just 2 weeks ago and celebrated virtually, and we've been continuing to come up with basically ways to innovate and to stay safe despite the pandemic, to celebrate our legacy and also to look forward to a very bright future. You can learn more about the library on our homepage, Facebook page, Instagram page, all of the socials. So I invite you to do that if you are indeed interested. Tonight, we're delighted to be joined by William Drozdiak and Elaine Sciolino, and they'll be speaking about Bill's new book, The Last President of Europe, Emmanuel Macron's Race to Revive France and Save the World. And I'll just read their very, very impressive bios very quickly here. For more than 4 decades, William Drozdiak has been regarded as one of the most knowledgeable American observers of European affairs. During his tenure as foreign editor of the Washington Post, the newspaper won Pulitzer Prizes for its international reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the collapse of the Soviet Communist Empire. He also served as the Post's chief European correspondent, based at various times in Bonn, Berlin, Paris, and Brussels. He later became the founding executive director of the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Center in Brussels and served for 10 years as president of the American Council on Germany. Before becoming a journalist, he played professional basketball in the United States and Europe for 7 years. His highly acclaimed book, Fractured Continent, Europe's Crises and the Fate of the West, was selected by the Financial Times as one of the best political books of 2017. Also joining us moderating tonight is, of course, Elaine Sciolino, who is a many times return guest to our Evenings with an Author program. So Elaine Sciolino is a contributing writer and former Paris bureau chief for the New York Times, based in France, I should say, since 2002. Her latest book, The Seine, The River That Made Paris, was published in 2019 and has just been released in paperback, I believe, so you can tell us more about that if you'd like, Elaine. Her previous book, The Only Street in Paris, Life on the Rue de Martyr, was published in 2015 and was a New York Times bestseller. In 2010, Elaine was decorated Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, the highest honor of the French state, for her special contribution to the friendship between France and the United States. So again, thank you very, very much, Bill and Elaine, for joining us tonight. And I will go ahead and hand it over to Elaine for the interview.
Well, this is so exciting for me to be with my friend and former colleague, Bill Drozdiak. It's great because he's sort of his style as a shooting guard and an NCAA scholar athlete informed his journalism. I mean, our paths crossed. We were trying to figure out, did we first meet in 1978 in Nifli-le-Château when Ayatollah Khomeini was there, or did we? We know we met in Iraq in 1984 when Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iranians in the Iran-Iraq War. Excuse me. Bill and I are very different in journalists. I'm a baker. I make fruitcakes with too many fruits and nuts. He is a 6'5" ex-basketball player, is a dancer. Everything he does is effortless. And he can write lead-alls, and it's like the lead of the paper, faster than I can write the third paragraph. Alas, we were always frenemies professionally He was with Time when I was with Newsweek. He was with the Washington Post when I was with the New York Times. But if either of us ever got really in trouble, we know that the other one would lift the friend out of the ditch and to safety. Although Bill is 6'5" and he's a bit bigger than I, he would have an easier time. I'd have to waive large denomination bills and hire people to pull him. He's reinvented himself. You know, journalism, everybody's saying it's in trouble and all that. Bill has effortlessly reinvented himself as the best informed American on Europe with the clearest voice. And I'm proud to turn it over now to Bill Drozdiak. Bill, tell us all about your wonderful new book.
Well, thank you, Elaine, and thanks to the American Library of Paris for hosting this event. It's wonderful to be with you. We've been friends and friendly adversaries for 40 years as we were thinking back over our recent histories, and it's a delight to be with you, if only virtually. The origin of my book really came about when I was looking across the European landscape and was saying, who was the most interesting leader? In my previous book, I had spent some time with Angela Merkel, and when I was at the American Council on Germany, I saw her on a fairly regular basis, and she has elicited great admiration for the way in which she has led Germany over the past 15 years. But to be truthful, Angela Merkel has never shown a kind of visionary leadership for Europe that her predecessors like Helmut Kohl, like Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt and Konrad Adenauer had shown. But when Emmanuel Macron was elected in 2017, he quickly showed that he was going to be the most pro-European president France had ever elected in the post-war era. And he realized that for Europe to make a great leap forward, it was going to require a resurrection of the French-German tandem. And so he wanted to bring Angela Merkel and somehow persuade her that he was serious about his plans for France, Europe, and reshaping the world order. And it was really the magnitude of his ambitions as a neophyte politician, one who had never been elected to political office before and suddenly ascends to the French presidency, that really struck me, and thought he would make him a worthy figure for a political book of this nature. And so I divided, because his ambitions were threefold. One was to modernize France, and all of you know how difficult that can be, because many of his predecessors promised to do that and never got anywhere with that challenge. Secondly, to reinvigorate Europe and break out of the stasis that Europe has found itself. And in particular now with Brexit and now 27 countries, Europe is having a hard time figuring out where it is actually going. And the third point, a reshaping of the world order with the retreat of the United States from global leadership that we've seen over the last 4 years and even beyond before that. And the rise of a powerful China and the resurgence of a belligerent Russia. And Macron has always said it's time for Europe to achieve full sovereignty on its own, and if it is going to survive as a power in its own right in this new world order. And so some of you may recall his Sorbonne speech in September of 2017, which he laid out his plans for Europe. Very ambitious, very aggressive plans to push Europe forward. And of course, it met with a lot of skepticism and negativism across Europe. So what I decided to do with the book in terms of the reporting was to divide the narrative into three parts. One, dealing with France and the difficulties he had in pushing through his reform program. Second part about Europe, dealing with the populist menace, his troubled and difficult relationship with Angela Merkel to get the French-German engine moving again. And then lastly, to the fracturing of Europe into north-south and east-west segments. The north, the rich north, who are creditors, and the poor southern neighbors who are indebted. And we saw that for the past 10 years since the financial crisis and then the Greek debt crisis. And now that has come back with a vengeance in with the global pandemic. And then the East-West split with Hungary and Poland becoming illiberal, if not authoritarian style governments, breaking with the rules of law that have governed the European Union in the past. And the final section deals with reshaping the world order. And Macron told me during the course of several interviews that we had that he, as a neophyte, he felt he had to make foreign policy on the fly, dealing with the personalities themselves. And so I thought it'd be interesting to explore his relationships with the key personalities, starting with, there's a chapter on dealing with the Donald, his up and down relationship with President Trump. There's a chapter on his dealings with Vladimir Putin, also one on China and how China has tried to exploit the divisions within Europe as it seeks to gain even greater control of the world through its Belt and Road Initiative. And finally, there's a last chapter which sort of looks back on one of our last conversations. I asked, we were talking about the geopolitical structure of the world in the future. And I said, 30 years from now, when you look back over those decades, what do you think will be the most dominant changes? As he often does, he turned the tables and he said, well, what for you over the last 30 years was the big change? And I said, well, as a journalist who has covered Europe, I have to say it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then later on the amazing rise of China, along with the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. But and I said, so what do you think the world will look like 30 years from now? He says, I think the biggest change will be the spectacular transformation of Africa. And so I got him to elaborate on that a bit, which I found quite fascinating. And he focused on Fernand Braudel, the famous French philosopher who envisioned Africa and Europe coming together as two different civilizations. And this again underscores the nature of Macron as a leader, that he really has a philosophical bent, and he approaches the world in that way. And it's very hard to find another leader who has that turn of mind. And I think that is what has made him, for me anyway, a compelling and fascinating figure to profile through the pages of this book.
Well, picking up from where you just left off, and thank you so much, Bill, for your brilliant kind of summary of your thesis. You capture early on in the book this moment where he's in the Auvergne, he's in a working class part of France, and the French are saying, "We hate you." There was a sign, "Sending you to the guillotine is our mission. President of the rich, resign, you asshole." At this moment, and for several moments in his presidency, and one can even say today, the French don't like him. And yet you seem to really like Macron. I mean, why do you think the French don't really like him? And what did you see in these extraordinary encounters that you've had with him that made you really like this guy?
I think he's got the courage of his convictions in a way that I haven't seen among modern leaders today, who kind of bend with the prevailing winds. I remember that period quite vividly, because after that event in Puy-en-Velin, he sort of holed up in the Élysée for about 3 weeks and didn't really go out. And I think he was undergoing some kind of a personal depression during that period. And then it was then when he he finally came out of that when he hit on the idea of the great national debates that would take him around the country, in which he subjected himself to humiliating abuse from the public for up to 7 hours at a time in these open town hall meetings. But at one point, I guess it was after the Gilets Jaunes protests had died down a little bit. I think it was in February of 2018. We had a conversation in which we were discussing these, the inability to comprehend what was behind and what the ferocity of these protests. And he said, I asked him a question, what has surprised you the most in your first 2 years in power? Being president. And he was a bit skeptical. He asked, well, why are you at? I said, well, when I interviewed Bill Clinton after his first 2 years in power, he gave me the answer saying, you know, it was how powerless I feel as president of the free world because I can be tied down by Congress and so many others. And he said, no, I wouldn't give that answer. He said, I think the biggest surprise for me has been la haine. And we were speaking French in all of these interviews, and he went on at length about saying that it's one thing to disagree strongly with people's opinions. He said, I'm trying to modernize, tug France into the 21st century, make it less dependent on the state, imbue the young people with a sense of entrepreneurialism, you know, particularly at a time with the digital technologies on the rise. And he said, if it's one thing if you disagree with me and then put forward a different plan, and maybe we can find a way to agree. It's another thing if you just lash out and attack people in such a violent way. And he said that's what has surprised him the most, the hatred that he encountered in politics and trying to come forward with his views. And he added, by the way, the same, while it wasn't as vitriolic a response by the other European leaders, when he presented his ideas for pushing Europe forward, he said he met with the same kind of resistance. They said, absolutely not, we can't do this. And he said, well, come forward with your own ideas. Let's and we'll reach a compromise. And he said, it was never happening. And I think this is what led me to title the book, The Last President of Europe. Obviously, there will be other presidents who come along. But the reason I titled it that way is because after doing all the reporting and the writing of the book, I realized he is really the only leader today in Europe who is faithful to the values and ideals of the founding fathers of the European Union. Back in, which is now, those leaders 70 years ago were talking grandiose plans for a United States of Europe, and Macron surprisingly has been faithful to those ideals and tried to persuade other leaders to, and as well as the French people, to join him in that view, saying that the 21st century France and Europe can only survive as being by coming together and using its collective power as a way of standing up to the United States, China, and Russia, because otherwise, as has been put before, if Europe is not a player, it will soon become a playground for others.
Do you find that he's evolved at all? I mean, early on particularly, but even today, he's been criticized for his arrogance. And I mean, do you think? I mean, is he a self-aware person? Is he self-critical or reflective, or is he a person that really has this hard shell that's just impossible to penetrate?
I think the arrogance has been one of his biggest problems to overcome. His wife, Brigitte, has actually tried to bring him down to the ground. When he first started as president, he thought this, the name for him, Jupiter, came out of his aspiration to float above the fray. And as many of you know, the tradition in the Fifth Republic has been for French presidents to use their prime ministers as a shield from the daily tribulations of politics. Well, Macron is such a micromanager. He was putting himself out there and exposing himself to all this criticism rather than allowing his Edouard Philippe, his prime minister at the time, to take these blows. But it's the arrogance factor was he thought, well, I'll try to be above the fray, and that only compounded his arrogance. He then, as Hubert Védrine, who was the former chief of staff and foreign minister under Francois Mitterrand, told me, he said he met with him and Macron asked his advice, and he said, how long can I stay above the fray like Mitterrand? He said, well, when Mitterrand came under criticism, he would disappear for 5 days. And his staff would have to tell the public, well, the president is thinking big thoughts about the future of the world. And of course, he was probably out in the countryside or meeting up with friends. And then when he would come back, the criticism had died down. But Macron said, I can't do that with social media the way it is. I'm under scrutiny 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So he then went back to his micromanaging style, and of course that subjected him to even more criticism. But I think your point is correct, Elaine. He is genuinely a cold and distant figure. He's had a hard time breaking the ice, and you can do all sorts of, psychological, going back into his childhood, what was behind that, the unusual relationship with Brigitte, who was his teacher and is 24 years older than he is, and how that may have been contributed to his formation. But whatever it is, he still has that reputation that he has been unable to alleviate, no matter how many times he goes out and shakes hands with people. He's still regarded as a cold, arrogant, and distant figure. I did not find him that way at all. I found him to be, private setting, quite charming and funny in some ways. But it's in front of crowds, he can look stiff and not very warm. It's quite a contrast to Jacques Chirac, who I covered for the Washington Post when I was based in Paris in the in the 90s. And Chirac was beloved by common people because he would go into a bar, have a beer, eat a sandwich with them, and being very touchy, but that's not Macron's style.
No, Jacques Chirac, the first time I ever met him, kissed my hand. The first time I met Macron, he wouldn't answer my question and turned away from me. So that's my experience with Macron. Tell us, you said that he can be funny. Tell us, you've had this extraordinary chance to be close to him in a way that no other journalist has. And tell us some wonderful warm moment with him, or like something that surprised you about him that kind of will capture who he is and his personality.
Well, I did find that we have we share a love for good French wine, and this is something that, to my he says, yeah, I have a glass of wine for lunch and a glass of wine for dinner, and and this is something that I think has endeared him to winemakers in France, maybe not to doctors. Who might think that that's setting a bad example, but no, I think he's, but even more than humor, he's not a warm person, but he does have this turn of mind, really, that focus on philosophy and sort of examining life from the perspective of a philosopher. And I found him on a number of occasions to be quite dour, pessimistic about the fate of Europe, and the difficulty of getting the French people to realize the importance of change and reform, and really the fate of the world. I mean, now I haven't interviewed him since the pandemic started, but this is really something that I think has transformed the thinking of many leaders. And indeed, this was the one event that after 3 years of pleading with Angela Merkel that that Germany needed to work with France to bring Europe back from the brink, she finally changed her opinion and her perspective, and that led to the agreement of the European Recovery Fund in July. Now we'll see if that actually materializes the way it's supposed to, but that was a hopeful sign that that even Germany, the leader of Germany, has come around to the view that Europe has to make a dramatic leap forward if it is going to cope with the challenges it now faces.
Bill, you evoked his wife, Brigitte. Can you tell us what's the key to the relationship? And you talked a little bit about her influence on him, but the relationship is still a mystery. It's very common for men to marry younger women, and Donald Trump is 24 years older than his wife, and I married a younger man, although he's only 5 years younger. So I appreciate younger men. But tell me about the relationship and what makes it work.
Well, I would, I think it is because she seems to have a greater empathy with common people.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that comes from the fact that her family were shopkeepers, they ran a chocolate shop and that sort of thing, and also being a teacher for many years. She is not inclined to think grand thoughts, philosophical ideas. She's more determined. And in terms of her relationship with him, I think she has tried to make him to humanize him more, to get him out. I mean, she gets out, or did anyway. She would go to the local bakers and make small talk with people. I think in terms of policy, she's had some influence on him when it comes to culture and education. He made education a big part of his presidency, and that's largely been driven by her. And you can see it in the way the Élysée Palace, the living areas, are decorated. It's with much more brighter, warmer, more lively modern art than I've ever seen it in the past when I visited it. And so those are the areas where she's really had a strong impact. And the other thing is the fact that her 3 children are all seem to have a very warm and loving relationship with their stepfather, who, in the case of, I think, the daughter, is the same ages.
Do you think he ever wanted to have children of his own?
I never asked him that question, but I think his parents, from what I had read of the accounts that his parents gave, was that one of the factors that they that made them so anxious and troubled about the relationship was the fact that they feared he would never have children of his own.
Yeah. You mentioned COVID and how it brought Macron together with Angela Merkel, but could you also look at COVID in a way as an example of the end of Europe? Because what happened? All of the borders got closed, and the nation state became much more important, and Europe-wide cooperation kind of deteriorated. So speak, put the whole COVID crisis into your thesis. I assume if there's a second edition of the book or a paperback, you might even have another chapter or on how this affected both Macron, but also the future of Europe.
Well, I think it shows the gross shortcomings of the incomplete nature of the European Union. I mean, for example, the European Union has no ability to handle a common health policy.
Yes.
Well, that was the first problem that erupted when COVID struck in Italy and then other countries, is that there was no common approach to deal with this. I would think that a challenge of this magnitude should persuade populations and leaders that Europe can only get its act together in dealing with these cross-border challenges through a greater leap toward what could be called a United States of Europe. That there should be some form of a common federal approach across Europe on health problems. But it's difficult. I mean, look at the United States. We have doctors pleading for a federal approach to dealing with the pandemic, and it's been disregarded by the administration. So as a result, you have a similar type of scramble among the 50 states trying to get masks or equipment and that sort of thing, very much resembling the chaotic scramble that we saw in Europe. So I think this is a matter of establishing in people's minds, showing that Europe, a more united Europe, is the only way that that the continent is going to be able to deal with these challenges, such as the pandemic, that are increasingly going to be cross-border challenges, that they cannot be dealt with by national governments alone, that it's going to require cross-border cooperation of it to a degree that we have not seen in the past.
Well, and of course, you do have a common EU policy on the closed borders with the United States, for example.
Yes, that's been in terms of travel, and 2-week quarantines.
Right.
That has become necessary because of the risks of transmission, and it's the same policy is now being pursued here.
Yes. Can you address another issue that obviously is the issue du jour, which is terrorism and this the beheading of a teacher, which has terrified and united France in an extraordinary way, left and right. What you touch on terrorism in the book. It's not a major subject. You do touch on terrorism and the challenge that Macron has faced in terms of integrating the Muslim population into the fabric of France. Speak a little bit about how you see it from your view. I mean, how can he best move forward? I mean, even before the horrific beheading, he was trying to come up with a policy to eliminate, the separatism in the sense of, the two Frances that Emmanuel Valls once talked about. But give us your view here.
Yeah, well, I have to admit he has made very little progress in dealing with this crisis. I mean, he came in, the country was still reeling from the trauma of the Bataclan massacre in 2015 and then subsequent terrorist attacks. And I think that the first response was to strengthen the hand of the security forces. And then we saw that also with the Gilets Jaunes, which many people complained about the crackdown on the protests being much too brutal than was necessary. But I think the real tragedy that France faces, since it does play host, it has the largest Muslim population in Europe, is dealing with the disaffected third, fourth generation of Muslims who have been out there in suburban ghettos, who have not been integrated into the mainstream society. I know there ideas are out there. Here in the United States, we seem to have made some progress by electing the first Black president, Barack Obama, and then through the cause of affirmative action. But now we seem to be regressing, as we've seen with the protests over George Floyd and others. In France, it's the same thing. I mean, I remember back in the 90s talking to the head of the École Nationale d'Administration. I said, what about a affirmative action program to bring in the offspring of from the suburban ghettos? And he said, no, this is anathema to the idea of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And so that France could never adopt this kind of a policy. But something is going to have to be done to absorb or bring into the mainstream, to make people think from these underprivileged backgrounds that they have something worth living for rather than to die for. And that has been the appeal of Islamic radicalists, radicalism, the Islamic State, others using social media to draw disaffected youths into this effort to almost a cult-like trance to believe that you can die for something that is more noble than yourself. Well, you need something much more pragmatic and that could prove to people that these young people, that they have something worth living for. And that's a problem for the West. It's a problem in Europe and in France, and also in the United States, where we see inequalities growing between not just the rich and the poor, but also the well-educated and those who haven't been able to get that kind of education.
But in the United States, you've got a real conversation going, and you've got a voice now being given to the disenfranchised and the disaffected. And I just wonder if someone like Macron, who's really still considered the president of the French and an elitist, really gets it in terms of what you need to do to somehow bridge, have a partage, have a conversation with these disaffected communities all through France. I mean, you could look at, you could ask the question, has anything really changed since the riots of 2005 to change the everyday lives of people living in these communities?
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is, Elaine. I mean, it could be, there was a political leader that rose from these communities and sort of gave hope, sort of as a role model for the disaffected and alienated young French people, second and third generation immigrants, much like Barack Obama did for the Black community when he was elected in 2008. It was a feeling of great of joy and relief, and Americans felt good about themselves because it looked like we were putting the race problem behind us. But in fact, if you look back, those 8 years that Obama was president, very little, if any, progress was made in terms of race relations.
We've stressed please go ahead.
No, I think this is what is it's disillusioning for a lot of people. Even if there was this kind of a role model who would rise, it's hard to see how one person taking over as president or in other powerful position in France could alleviate these tensions.
Bill, we could talk forever, and I don't want to run out of time before we move into the whole other part of your book, which is Macron and the world. And you've done this brilliant job of talking about his relationships with all the other powers, the United States, China, Russia, Iran. Tell us just a little bit about two of the relationships, his relationship with Trump and his relationship with Putin, and how has he used the force of his personality and his worldview to try to seduce these two leaders?
Well, I think he, as I said earlier, he perceives foreign policy in terms of personalities. And he felt that if he could establish a working rapport with Trump, it would help sustain the transatlantic relationship through a difficult phase. I mean, as became evident, Angela Merkel couldn't stand being in the same room with Trump, and basically said to Macron, if you can do it, be my guest. And that's why other European leaders started referring to him as the Trump whisperer. And when he was invited by Trump to Washington for the first state visit of his administration, it was seen to be quite a triumph in terms of Macron's ability to reach out to this person. But Trump proved to be such an erratic figure that it was, he could never sustain this. He tried to persuade him on why it would be foolish and counterproductive to pull out of the Paris Climate Change Accord, and why it was foolish to pull out of the Iran agreement. But Trump wouldn't buy that. And when the first Oval Office meeting they had, which Macron described to me, he went in, he had rehearsed a careful presentation saying how important it was for Europe and the United States to work together in developing a common front, a common policy approach toward China. He was immediately interrupted by Trump. He said, oh, what the hell do you mean? Europe is much worse than China. And look at how the Germans exploit us, with the tariffs on automobiles and all that. So he was shocked, speechless. He tried to recover, and keep sustaining that relationship, because he thought they did have certain ingredients in common. They were both mavericks who never held political office before, who had destroyed the political establishments in their respective countries. But despite all of the effort that Macron put into cultivating the relationship, it never paid off. And similarly, he's tried to reach out to Putin and saying that, in the belief that Europe will only be safe and secure when it can establish a security partnership with Russia and a dialogue with the leader. And as he says, he told me, I know how despicable Putin is and how he is responsible for these assassinations, but Europe needs to reach out and establish a working partnership, a working relationship with Russia. And I said, well, what makes you think he will turn back toward the West rather than toward China, as he seems to be doing now? And he said, Putin, c'est un fils de Saint Petersburg, meaning he's from St. Petersburg. He will fall in the line of Peter the Great and look toward a Western modernizing approach for his country. And I said, well, à mon avis, il est plutôt un fils de KGB. And I think that is, in my view anyway, that's the formative experience for Putin, and why he has rejected Macron's appeals to turn back toward the West. But we'll see how it plays out. Macron says this is a long-term relationship, that if Russia seeks accommodation with China over Europe, it will be very much the junior partner, and Russia will be even further exploited by China. So that's, in a nutshell, is how he sees it.
And China, the relationship, I mean, Macron has tried to do magic with China, according to your book.
Right, he's made a point of going there every year and meeting with Xi. He's tried to form a common front in Europe toward China without much success, because China has been very effective at playing divide and conquer among the various European states. It knows that Germany, being a country that is very dependent on its exports, will do anything to maintain a prosperous trading relationship, even going silent in terms of human rights abuses, as we have seen. But Macron's view is that the longer term relationship, and he said this on his first trip, which I thought laid the foundation for what could be the right strategic approach by the West toward China. Is that it should be based on reciprocity, that there have to be common rules that the West and China can agree upon and live by. You can't have one side exploiting the system for its own gain, which has gone on for so many years. And that's why I think looking forward, Macron wants to divorce Europe's approach from that of the United States, because I think he sees the United States, whether it be under Trump or under Biden, heading on a collision course with China that would reluctantly drag Europe in unless it can develop its own approach. So I think you're now hearing, from what I gather, Macron pushing Europe to develop an independent strategy toward China that would help secure its own sovereignty.
Well, I wonder if this would be a great moment to turn the microphone back to Catherine, and maybe Catherine, would you like to ask our audience if they have some questions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Elaine. That was a fantastic interview. And yes, I'm already getting a lot of questions actually. So please do feel free to submit those via the chat feature if you have questions. We probably won't have time for everyone's. I just wanted to warn you in advance. I'll try to be as fair as I can here. So Bill, I'll go ahead and start to read some of these aloud for you then. So the first one I got is, does Macron understand what it is like to be poor?
Well, if you're sitting in the Elysee Palace, it's pretty hard to be empathetic toward the poor. I think he grew up in fairly comfortable surroundings. His parents were both doctors. He was not exposed to excessive luxury by any means. But he's had a very comfortable upbringing, and certainly during his school, going to elite schools, working for Rothschild for 4 years, he's had a fairly comfortable life. He has not pulled himself out of poverty by any means toward his current status. So I would say it's hard for him to conceive of what it is like to be poor, because he's never had that exposure.
All right, thank you. So the next one I'll take is from Tatiana, who's writing, how aware is Macron of the challenges that the world faces in the 21st century? How does he propose to deal with climate change, migration, and the rising role of China? So this was submitted before you and Elaine had gotten into some of those issues, but perhaps the climate change we haven't really heard about yet.
Right. Well, I think he's very open. He's fascinated by the science. He spends a lot of time. He has met with quite a number of scientists who are specialists in climate change. He's tried to make Paris a magnet for scientists and experts the world over in climate change, offering them special arrangements and stipends if they would come and do their research and work in Paris. So I think he's aware of this. As I said, he's a generation. That's what I found it fascinating to deal with a leader who is a generation younger than me, and his approach to the world is that of somebody who's much more concerned about these cross-border challenges like climate change and elsewhere. But I go into that at some length, in the last 4 chapters of the book, why it's important for not just France, but also Europe to show the world that there can be a new kind of globalization that can come out of these crises, a new kind of a new set of institutions to deal with these international challenges.
Okay, great. So the next question I'm seeing here is from Fran, who's writing, is Macron on track for a second quinquennat, so a second term? Will he have the chance, given the challenges of COVID, to make progress internationally?
Well, I think that's what he's angling for. I think you're seeing him calibrate his political positions in such a way on some issues, whether it be migration, and to steal away some votes from the right, where he might feel the biggest challenge. I would think that right now he expects a second term runoff to be between him and Marine Le Pen once again, in which case that he wants to undercut her ability to draw support from disaffected people on the right. But we'll see. It's still a long way to go until the elections in 2022, and the costs that of the pandemic, the economic costs are so enormous, with economic growth set to shrink by 9 or 10% in France this year. There are bound to be political and social consequences, and Macron could pay the price. Could be another moderate figure would arise from the center right. Could be even his previous prime minister, Edouard Philippe, who could become a rival and might be very difficult for him to defeat.
Okay, great. So you had already gestured to Africa that, well, Macron had said would be very important in the future. So Morgan is wondering here if you would go a little bit further into the role of France in Africa.
Well, I think there's there are several books that could be written about that. I mean, the colonial legacy for France is profound, but I think the immediate challenge is the efforts by Islamic State to resurrect itself in places like Mali and the Sahel. So the threat of terrorism is something that is constantly, I think, on Macron's mind, and that's why he took a leading role in trying to work out a settlement in Libya, because he's fearful that this could be the trafficking that comes through Libya from the Sahel region of Islamist radicals is something that could threaten France and the southern states in Europe. But I think it's in longer term, he sees, if you look at the demographic trajectories, I mean, he pointed out that by the end of the century, 1 in 3 human beings will be African. And given the nature of climate change, the spreading of droughts, the expansion of the deserts in Africa, the real risk, unless Europe mobilizes to help Africa deal with these challenges, Europe could be overwhelmed by enormous wave of immigration that would dwarf what we saw in 2015, 2016 out of Syria and Turkey and the Middle East. Because just one example, Lake Chad, there are 10 million people who live day to day off of the fish and other products that they get out of Lake Chad. Lake Chad is drying up. Some people say within 5 years, it will be uninhabitable. And those 10 million people need to move somewhere. And they're going to be so desperate, they won't necessarily want to settle in a neighboring country. They all have cell phones. They can look at how well Europe is living, and they'll want to move north and try to get into Europe. And so I think these are the longer term challenges that Macron and I think other leaders need to pay attention to when they consider the importance of helping Africa, helping the Middle East deal with the ramifications of climate change, drought, and a shortage of food.
Right, thank you. The next question is from James, who's writing, is Macron permanently disillusioned with the United States as a reliable ally, or would the election of Biden, shift that dynamic?
Well, I think, yes, he definitely believes in the importance of the transatlantic alliance, although he recognizes that it is changing. It has been changing really before Donald Trump. We saw under Barack Obama, who stressed the importance of a pivot toward Asia for the United States. And it's, for anybody looking at historical trends, after 75 years, of close American involvement in providing security guarantees for Europe, Macron realizes that a lot of it's natural for Americans to ask, isn't Europe rich enough and strong enough to stand on its own 2 feet and care for its own security issues while we have other things to do, starting with dealing with our domestic problems and the need for new infrastructure and coping with the social and economic inequalities in America. Because when let's say Biden gets elected, it is not going to be smooth sailing for the transatlantic alliance, because he is going to turn to Macron and other European leaders and saying, we have so much rebuilding to do at home that you are going to have to take care of your own responsibilities in a way you haven't done before. And so in some ways, it's going to come as a shock for European leaders to realize that the United States cannot afford and is not willing to be acting as the security guarantor anymore in the future for Europe.
Great, thank you. We'll just have time for one last question here. So what I'm seeing now is, do you think there's a kind of competition between European countries because of the lack of a common health policy? You can take that anywhere you want, perhaps with COVID as well.
Well, I don't know in terms of competition. I mean, we saw at the start, there was a scramble for masks and everything, and there was some competition, but it's, I think people realize now the way this virus can spread so easily across borders and with people traveling so frequently across borders that it can't be stopped unless there is unprecedented cooperation by health authorities and governments to cope with this. I mean, we see the second wave now surging in Europe as a result of some complacency after some success with the lockdowns in the early phase. Once people let down their guard and started traveling on vacation in July, August, early September, the virus has come surging back. And this is, I think, a lesson that we should absorb in the United States, because we're just starting to have a second wave, and over the next 3 months, it's going to get worse. So it's this pandemic has lessons for all of us in the West.
Great, thank you. And Bill, can I ask you to respond to one more? I have one more, if that's all right with you. Okay, great. So this is from Mary, who's sneaking it in under the wire here. She says, thank you for your presentation. It seems that Macron so far is the only leader to challenge the genocidal expansionist policy of Turkey's Erdogan. Now in the Caucasus, again, against the Armenians. Did you have a chance to talk to Macron about this?
No, during the course of my reporting for the book, the Nagorno-Karabakh crisis was not an issue, but he is certainly, but Turkey is on his mind. He spoke to me about Turkey and about Erdogan's authoritarian tendencies, and he spoke in a similar vein as he did with Putin, that these are two authoritarian leaders whose acts you can find despicable, but they are leaders of important countries that, for strategic reasons, Europe needs to find a way either to contain or to cooperate in other areas for its own, in defense of its own interests. So I think this is why I think the fact that French sent some military vessels to the Eastern Mediterranean to challenge Turkey and to defend the interests of Greece, a fellow European Union member, was an important show of support. Certainly was recognized by Prime Minister Mitsotakis of Greece, and I think other EU leaders who were reluctant, such as Angela Merkel. She did not want to speak out on behalf of Greece's claims in Eastern Mediterranean because she didn't want to antagonize Erdogan. But this was a case where Macron realized that Europe had to show its solidarity with a fellow member. So I think this characterizes him. On the one hand, he's not afraid of having conversations with Erdogan and Putin on issues that are important to Europe's own interests. And he's not afraid of criticizing them when necessary. But you've got to find a way to contain and also cooperate with these countries.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you again to the audience for your wonderful questions, and of course, especially to Bill and Elaine for this conversation tonight. It's been incredible. Thank you for being here. And I have to say, I also read the book. I also loved the book. Elaine's holding hers up as well. I think a lot of the staff at the American Library have really, really enjoyed this book. So you've been an important part of our community in recent weeks. Bill, thank you so much for this wonderful work. And might I ask before we go, where can people purchase the book if they would like to find it either locally or internationally?
Well, I think in Paris it's available at some English bookshops, the Red Wheelbarrow, I believe, in the Sixth Avenue Mall, and
exactly,
and Shakespeare and Company. But you could also order it from independent companies or Barnes and Noble or Amazon, what have you. And, but I look forward to staying in touch with the American Library in Paris and eventually getting over there to visit one of my favorite cities and to see wonderful friends like Elaine and others whom I miss very much.
We'll give you a big party.
Absolutely.
Sounds great.
Thank you both. It's been a real pleasure to have you. I will wrap up by saying a couple of words about some upcoming programs while I have your attention here. So next week on Tuesday, we'll be hosting a panel of French scholars who will be discussing the American dream, whether we can still talk about that concept, for whom the American dream might still be alive, if anybody in the United States. So that should be a really interesting event to attend, 1 week out from the US presidential elections. You can go ahead and sign up on our homepage if you're interested in that. And then on Thursday next week, we're also hosting another panel on the theme of writers reading during the pandemic. We'll be joined by Joyce Carol Oates, Edmund White, and Sheila Kohler, who will share their perspectives on what they've been reading, how reading has been important to them through these, this tumultuous year, and it's sure to be a really great event as well. So I hope you might continue to join us for Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. And thank you for being here again. I want to mention really quickly too that we do invite you to donate, as we are a nonprofit. Generally in person, we accept donations of about 10 euros. If you enjoyed the event tonight, you're more than welcome to click on the link that I sent out with the Zoom meeting link, and just show your support for the library if you've enjoyed this event with Elaine and Bill. Thank you everybody so much, and until next time.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye.
You too. Bye.
Goodbye.